Another type of risk assessment that you can conduct is a qualitative risk assessment. Qualitative risk assessments are based on subjective opinion, really, as opposed to hard numbers. Now, this would be subjective numbers that are really based on things like the likelihood of a threat occurring, the impact that that realized threat would have against an asset, and the threat would be given some kind of a severity level rating. And depending on who is conducting the qualitative risk assessment might mean that we get different severity rating levels applied. And that's why it's called qualitative and not a quantitative risk assessment. But it doesn't mean that it's any less important than a quantitative assessment. Now, one way that we can properly manage the different types of risks in one place in a list so that we have an easy way to look at the relative severity ratings would be in a risk register. Organizations should have one or more risk registers, depending on whether they're assessing the entire organization or just one department or maybe just a project. So you might have multiple risk registers, but it doesn't change what goes into it. It's a centralized list of risks with severity level ratings, who's responsible for incident response, and also the mitigating control that has been put in place within the organization against that risk. So generally, when we work with the risk register, we're usually talking about qualitative numbers, things like severity level ratings and impact level ratings, that type of thing. There are times when in a risk register you might see dollar values, but usually it's qualitative in nature. So in our example, we have a number of risks numbered in a risk register, and we've got a date that it was put in the register, a title that goes along with that risk item, the likelihood, which we see is high, low, and medium. So someone has to decide that that is appropriate for the given risk. The impact it would have, same type of thing. Is it a high, low, or medium type of impact? The owner of that risk and any mitigation that might have been put in place. In our first example, the mitigation is actually referring to an incident response plan or an IRP number. Taking it a step further, we can also generate a risk heat map. Now, a heat map allows us to take our severity levels for our risks from a risk register and map them essentially in a visually compelling type of graph where the color levels imply the level of risk. So for example, we might have a risk heat map that has red blocks that indicate high types of risks or high levels of impact, depending on what you are representing in your heat map. And the numbers within the heat map actually reference the number of the risk from the risk register. So we know what risk that those colored blocks would really relate to. Now we can take that in another direction. Instead of having colors, we could just have a risk matrix. A risk matrix really allows us to have all the details related to risks in one centralized location. You can pull that from the risk register, but you can also plot it on a severity level type of graph, but without using colors. So a risk matrix is kind of like a risk heat map minus the colors. So quantitative risk assessments are based on hard numbers, but qualitative are more subjective based on severity levels related to the risk itself and the impact it would have against an asset.